So welcome back, environmentalist, and we'll be looking at the tail end of, or the remainder of, endangered species today. We left off when we were looking at the cooperative efforts of the state with the federal government. So let's move into Section 7, and these are biological opinions. The Endangered Species Act considers the National Marine Fisheries Service and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as the biological experts that are used in determinations of any kind of federal action that may occur. That could be an enforcement action, that could be criteria, listing, and so forth. So they are the two primary entities that are considered the experts and recognized as valid data contributing expertise for these decisions. So let's move into Section 9. Section 9 is the prohibitions and the enforcement section, so I'd like to kind of call it this. You have a set of rules, and you know those set of rules. It simply says the set of rules are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, whatever they mean. And this doesn't have anything to do with the ESA except as a comparison. Let's say that one of those rules is that you must have an exemption to maybe not file your taxes at XYZ amount of time. If you didn't have that exemption and your taxes were due on tax day, or you hadn't filed an extension, then you would be held accountable for not meeting a deadline. So you would be enforced upon accordingly, which is the penalty side. So that's how the Endangered Species Act works. Section 9 tells you what the rules are, what the prohibitions are. Section 10 gives you the exceptions and a way to get permitted to do what the enforcement or prohibitions say you can't do under a guidance permit that will put limitations on what is legal. And then, of course, Section 11 deals with what's the bad news if you chose to break the rules in Section 9 and didn't have an exemption or a permit in Section 10. So basically, the Marine Fisheries Service and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service designate as the two enforcement agencies for the Endangered Species Act. Oftentimes people think it's the Environmental Protection Agency. They are not the regulatory agency that handles this particular aspect of the law, meaning Endangered Species Act. So Section 9 actually prohibits the illegal possession, import, export, interstate, or foreign sale of a listed species. It also makes it illegal to take a listed species from the wild. Underscore that word take. That's a really important term. So let's define what a taking of a term means. So taking is defined as any person that harms, shoots, pursues, hunts, wounds, harasses, kills, traps, captures, collects, or attempts to engage in any such conduct. In most cases, taking is inadvertent. So the enforcement and prohibitions of taking are important to the Endangered Species Act. Taking involves a protected species, and it can mean their habitat. I want you to think about that for a minute. So in going back to the discussions that we had first day of endangered species, we talked about habitat and eminent domain. Eminent domain can be used in this situation where habitat may be needed to protect the range or the survival of a species. So that puts kind of a double-edged sword there in terms of people who might feel infringed on that. And I'll go back to ranchers. Maybe there's a range of the Mexican wolf, and the Mexican wolf comes through their property, and yet the government needs to seize some of that property and pay fair market value for habitat. From a different point of view, the enforcement side of this would be is if you took habitat of a protected species. So in the picture you're seeing here, this is the Goldencheeked Warbler, who's endangered, and its habitat is in the Edwards Plateau, which is here in Texas. So let's say that you were building a house out in Austin or south of Austin in the known territory range of the Goldencheeked Warbler and you took down its known nesting site, which is in usually a juniper or cedar tree, that would be a potential civil or criminal penalty. So let's look and see what an exemption is and how important the exemption is for the penalties that are associated. So if there's a prohibition and there's actual laws that are put in place in Section 9 that say you cannot do this, the ESA does make allowances and exceptions to the rule. Those are all found in Section 10. So if a project occurs in the habitat of a listed species, the government can grant an exception and place limits on what is an acceptable use of that land. So I'm going to use an example that may not apply to the Endangered Species Act, but it will be relative to those of you who live in the Waco area. When Waco raised the level of the lake by 7 feet, they displaced a number of organisms that lived in the riparian zone of that land that used to be exposed that now is covered by water. So working with the Fish and Wildlife Service and at that time EPA dealing with the water issue, habitat had to be given back, and that's how the wetlands came to be for the city of Waco. So if you can't avoid harm, here's the next thing. The project agency can seek an exemption from the Endangered Species Committee, and it's made up of key personnel representatives of the state, and they can give an exception or a permit. So typically, in order to take animals of any sort or plants, meaning you meet the definition of taking, you've got to have a permit that allows for an exemption to be met. If you don't, then you are going to be culpable of taking of an endangered species. Here's an example of a Section 10 exemption. The Portland Audubon Society filed suit against the Endangered Species Committee. Remember, that's a group of 5 to 7 key individuals that got heard in the Ninth Court of Appeals in 1992. This was a real national face case having to do with the northern spotted owl. Outcome of the case found that several of the members had had contact with the president of that time in such a way that made their vote pretty much null and void. So the exemption for the Bureau of Land Management timber sale of accidental taking of the endangered spotted owl in Oregon, the state of Oregon, was examined. So basically, BLM had timber sales that they did, and incidental taking of the spotted owl's habitat occurred. Well, BLM is a federal entity. They're still held accountable for meeting the laws. So the northern spotted owl had been listed as a threatened species, and if you recall, threatened species and endangered and critically endangered get full protection of the Endangered Species Act. So it was protected as threatened throughout its range of Northern California, Oregon, and Washington State in 1990. And the reason was of loss of old growth forest. So like Redwood National Forest is in that area as an example. As you go up to Washington State, that's where Olympic National Forest is. These are very old growth, large trees that we discussed in the biomes lecture. So the Fish and Wildlife Service had previously reviewed the status of the spotted owl in 1982 and 1987 and 1989, but found it did not warrant listing as either threatened or endangered. So logging continued in national forests containing the northern spotted owl, but it got stopped by a court order because of this particular lawsuit. So you might have heard of tree huggers. In this particular case, there were some very environmentally proactive bird lovers, specifically of the spotted owl, who actually chained themselves to trees, duct taped themselves to trees that were supposed to be cut down as a protest for this particular deal. So that's just one example. Now, the Section 11 of the ESA deals with penalties and enforcement. This is where the dollars and the actual enforcement case will come to be. So that means you broke a rule in Section 9. You didn't have an exemption or a permit to do that in Section 10. So Section 11 is going to be the bad news. The bad news is if you're hit with a criminal penalty, it can be a fine up to $50,000 per day per violation, and I want to emphasize the and or. So if you end up or know somebody that ends up with an enforcement case for the Endangered Species Act, there's two routes it can go. Civil or criminal. Obviously, you always want the civil choice, but criminal penalties are very itemized and blatant. It can be up to $50,000 per day per violation, and the or part's important. And the and part is important. When you read legislation, it could say and, it could say or, but when it says and or, it can go either way. So it means they could have imprisonment for 1 year for very specific serious violations, and or they could have a fine up to either $50,000 for specific violations or a fine up to $25,000 for lesser violations that are listed in the law. So criminal is not a way to go. Typically criminal citations, they knew better, they had background, they were culpable. So a case study of this occurred in the area of Alaska. A guy that owned a fishing rig, and the fishing rig had to report a certain amount of fish that they caught per day. Sablefish and halibut, both which have regulated quantities that can be done. So he basically put a quota, said he was meeting his quota, and valued his fish at a certain dollar amount. What happened was he falsified the reports. The reports showed a lesser value than what the fish were worth, and he actually fished in an area that was not allowed to be fished in and submitted false federal reports. The end story for this guy was, due to the serious nature of the offense and the no knowledge that he was breaking the law, he spent 10 months in prison. He paid a $50,000 fine, and he paid $100,000 in community service payment to the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation to enhance fishery habitat in Alaska. I'd say that was an expensive mistake. So sometimes people make choices and they know better. That's what the criminal side is for. All right, so civil side's not so big a deal, and we're not really worried about the civil side, so I just wanted to bring you to note on the criminal side before we move into our animals. So we're going to start our animals now, and for the ones that you see with the prefix of the IUCN, that means they're globally listed, and their current listing is on the red list. If you remember, the IUCN manages the red list. Well, African elephants fit in that scenario. African elephants had a ban of trade of ivory that passed in 1990. And it's because more than half of the population of African elephants had been eradicated due to poaching. So you're looking at, we're down from over 1.3 million individuals down to around 600,000. Kenya was one of the worst hit places and is a prime habitat for African savanna. And it decimated about 85% of the Kenya population of African elephants between 1973 and 1989. So elephants have issues with humans in the terms that they're very intelligent animals, and they're also always in look of habitat, which also includes watering resources. Males tend to be pretty unruly during must season, which is their mating season, and that's only for a few months of the year. But elephants get a bad rap. They've, stomped through villages, but oftentimes that's because people are in their way. But they're hunted primarily for their ivory tusks, which are worth monetary value. The rhinoceros is critically endangered. For most of our 20th century, the black rhino was the most numerous of all the rhinoceros species. That number dropped substantially from 200,000 living animals to about 2,500 in 2000, in the 1990s. By 2004, we had dropped down to right around 2,400. Rhinoceroses are killed by humans for their horns. Some species have more than one horn on their nostril. However, what's important about their horns is it's sold on the black market. It's not made out of ivory. It's actually made out of keratin, which is the same stuff that your fingernails grow from. So it's almost like a shock absorber if you've ever felt one. Some cultures use them as ornamental. They're used in medicines, aphrodisiacs, other types of things that are used in various different cultures that are important. Now, rhinos have very bad eyesight, but they have extremely good other senses that are available to them. So they would know you're there before you get there. So usually they're shot from a distance and killed that way. So sometimes they're killing mothers that can't uh, carry on the young, and the young die. Let's look at the giant panda bear. That's EN, and remember EN stands for endangered. Habitat loss is the panda bear's #1 problem, and low birth rates in captivity. Poor little panda bears live basically in one place in China. That's where their native habitat is, and they live in areas of bamboo. So they eat bamboo leaves, and basically that's what they live on. So after 1949, China just grew dramatically, having the largest population in the world now. And panda's habitat got torn down in many places so population could grow. So pandas were caged at any sign of decline in populations, leading to poor conditions, which also meant their captivity breeding didn't go very well. Right now, pandas are considered a rare species because of their rare existence, rare numbers, and their unique situations in zoos. The mountain gorilla has a famous story to tell. He is critically endangered. The forests where the mountain gorillas live are surrounded by rapidly increasing habitat that's being used by humans. Slash and burn practices, also used for agricultural gain, has taken away some of their natural habitat. This is a famous person that basically died for the cause of the mountain gorilla. This is Dian Fossey. You might have seen the movie Gorillas in the Mist, and that starred Sigourney Weaver. Sigourney looks a lot like this individual right here. Well, Dian Fossey was notorious. She really wasn't the best college student, and the recruiter that was looking for a wildlife biologist to go study the mountain gorillas in Africa asked a few things of her before she did that, and I was accepted. So you should read up on it. It's kind of a fun story to learn about. When she got there, she was appalled at the problem of poaching that was happening to the mountain gorilla and kind of went on a crusade to stop it. In 1977, her favorite gorilla that she had gotten to know, which is part of the story of Gorillas in the Mist, not only did she get to know these gorillas, she basically infiltrated their clan and became a member of that gorilla community. And the gorillas even allowed her to handle their babies and help raise them. So she basically became a gorilla person and lived with these animals. Her favorite animal was Digit, and Digit was beheaded by poachers, and with the intent she and her people would find him. So Digit initially was defended the day that this occurred by some dogs of the group, and the poachers, there were 6 of them that took Digit, that killed him, got away, and Digit was killed by multiple spear wounds, and then his hands and his head's cut off. So his hands in particular, that's an important symbolism. Hands of gorillas have significant nature and value in their culture. When Digit's body was recovered, Fossey's group set out to capture one of the killers, and they did. And the killer basically did what most do. They, if there's other involved, they implicated the rest of the group. So Fossey went on a rampage to try to make it very painfully clear that poaching is unacceptable and stirred up the poaching community. Whether or not that's what led to her death, many think that it is. Nevertheless, before she died, Fossey created a foundation that's still very active today, a nonprofit called the Digit Fund, to raise money for anti-poaching patrols. Fossey was murdered in 1985. The case remains open. She was killed in her hut in the middle of the night, and no one ever found out who it was. But it's thought to have been related to this anti-poaching campaign that she did. If one person could have made a dent in bringing the world to the knowledge of endangered species and the necessary need for anti-poaching and other conservation laws, it was Dian Fossey. So a very special woman. The humpback whale is LC, that means least concern now, but there was a time in the 20th century where at least 200,000 whales were killed. and the global population had reduced by 90%. So this was an imminent threat. It has come back from that imminent threat. Starting in 1946, the International Whaling Commission put a ban on over the whaling industry and basically imposed rules and regulations for hunting whales and set open and closed seasons for whale hunting. So it didn't completely eradicate it, but it certainly put very much bans on it. So commercial whaling ended up being banned in 1966 completely. So for about 20 years, it was still legal to hunt those animals. So the population had been reduced down to about 5,000. So now we're really in trouble. That ban is still in force, and populations have increased to literally 80,000 plus around the world. Humpbacks are tracked. And if you don't know about humpbacks, they have on their fins, they have a special white pattern, much like your fingerprint. And so whales are tracked based as they migrate back from Alaska to Hawaii on their annual journeys back and forth, and in their bubble feeding seasons where they're trying to fatten up for their migration. So kind of an interesting story there if you want to know that some of these animals have names. They're tagged even electronically, but they're identified by what's on the white print of their inside of their fin. Bengal tigers are endangered. They're endangered because they're have extreme value in certain cultures for not just the coat or the pelt of the animal. It's also for different tiger parts that have reason for medicine and aphrodisiacs and other types of things that are sold in certain kinds of lines of medicine. In 1900, it was estimated there were about 100,000 of these tigers in the world, but the top population has dwindled to less than 1% of that, or between 1 and 3%. And each tiger is unique. The stripes are like a fingerprint, so if you cut the fur off, they have stripes. I have a cat in Senna. When we had her fixed, Senna was striped. She kind of looks like a little tiger. And her stripes were still on her belly, and I had to laugh because I knew that about tigers, but she's a miniature version of a domesticated cat. And nevertheless, their tigers are like fingerprints. They're unique to that animal. A conservation effort really took place to protect Bengal tigers that were endangered, and it was called Project Tiger. It monitored 25 tiger reserves of reclaimed land that was adequate habitat for these large cats. The program has been credited with a remarkable turnaround for these animals, and in the 1990s, really since 1973 to 1990. Let's look at the Hawaiian monk seal. This is one I find to be really entertaining. I took this picture in Kauai, which is one of the main the islanders, or place that you can visit as an island tourist that you can live, and it's critically endangered. So their seals have an excellent fat and oils that are used for a variety of different purposes for fishing and other types of commercial use. Seal populations have declined rapidly due to human activity in even the most remote areas of the Hawaiian Islands. So the poachers are looking for these animals for the things that I just mentioned. Another source of their demise is entanglement in fishing nets. So fishing net laws have been set in certain areas of the world where there's otters or turtles or seals like this that need a certain size mesh in order to get through to survive, because they're mammals that require air. In Hawaii, if you see one of these things, the Fish and Marine Fisheries Service will actually block off areas of the beach where you are not supposed to come in contact, which is exactly what this was. I had a really good telephoto lens when I took this picture because it came up to take its sunshine bath on the shoreline, but people had to get away from it because there's a certain legal distance that you can and can't be near them. This is what he looked like as I zoomed in on him and taking a nap. It's one of the most endangered of all the seals species in the world, and it was listed in the ESA in 1976, making it totally illegal to do any taking of this particular Hawaiian monk seal. It's estimated as recently as 5 years or 6 years ago that there was just about 1,100 individuals that remain. All of them are tracked by our governing issue or entities for the Endangered Species Act. The manatee is another species of interest, and I love the manatee. They're very unique, interesting animals. You might know them as sea cows. There's another version of them that lives in Australia that's very rare that looks like a manatee. But manatees, especially in United States, you might notice ESA there, and I'll go back and point out that the Hawaiian monk seal is also protected by the Endangered Species Act. Manatees, especially in the Florida area, became a risk in the Florida Keys when that became a very popular tourist and actual living area, so most everybody had power boats. So manatees blend in so well with their habitat that it's almost impossible to see them. As a scuba diver, I can tell you I've run into some of these, and you just don't know they're there until you see them. And if you're trolling through known habitat, there's speed limit enforced signs now, where Florida has actually passed legislation at the state level requiring very specific awareness and sounding devices to make manatees kind of scare away from power boats. So manatees often will have scars on their backs. That's their biggest risk, is boat collisions. The Alaskan sea otter is endangered, and I have to tell you, this is one of my favorite sea creatures. I just love it. When I went to Alaska, we took a sea otter and whale excursion and saw a whole bunch of sea otters, and this is one of our little sea otter friends here. What amazed me was how they lived, and as a geologist, I find it very interesting on what they eat. Sea otters are extensively hunted and have been for hundreds of years because they have 2 layers of fur. And it's kind of neat because they've got like 1 million hairs per square inch of their body. So they have an excellent pelt, nicely said. Their coats are worth a lot of money. So an international ban on sea otter hunting was implemented in the 1900s simply because their population had declined. The Alaskan sea otter is a keystone species, and here's what that means is they control other parts of the ecosystem, and if a failure in the sea otter were to occur, a failure in the entire Alaskan ecosystem could go sour in the water environment. Sea otters are keystone species because they feed on animals that feed on this. This is kelp. What I found unique about these guys is that they would tie their little young ones up in the kelp at the surface, and the little babies, this is like a sea otter nursery right there, and they would tie them up so they wouldn't float away during high tide, and the adults would have a few on duty for any kind of other seal or animal that might want to have a sea otter for lunch. So they would be on baby duty, and the other adults would go find food. Well, what they're looking for are sea urchins. Sea urchins are round and usually spiny, and sea otters would take tools and they bust these things open. So they spend most of their life on their back, and they're very, very smart. And so they're looking for the stuff inside the shelly animal because they make a exoskeleton that they will have to break open. It's made out of calcium carbonate. And so the otters will feed that to their children. So that's why they're a keystone species. If they're eliminated, then the animals that feed on the kelp forest that keep it under control would be eliminated, and the kelp forest would get out of control. Polar bears are often discussed as an endangered species, but specifically they are threatened, and it took a long time to get them from vulnerable to threatened. Climate change is their story, and they're almost a symbol of climate change, but their story is not very happy. Here's the deal. Polar bears need ice fishing holes in order to find seals to eat. Bears in general usually require more than 100 square miles of habitat, or kilometers at least, to have a broad range of source of food. So when you get multiple polar bears sharing the same area, there's not enough seals to go around. So the polar bears are hunting platforms of ice that have holes in them where the seals pop up for air. So as climate change has set in and the ice rafts, for better lack of words, have shrunk in size, polar bears either have to swim out to areas further away from their normal sea ice blocks to maybe even floating sea blocks to try to find seals to eat. So swimming out there is a big enough endeavor. Swimming back could be even worse if you're in starvation. Add a third component. Most of the bears will be pregnant and give birth during this time, and so now they may have one or two cubs to contend with. So they may have to select which cub is more fit in order to survive that journey back. This is a real image of a polar bear swimming, and it's the story where many polar bears have drowned. So that's where the climate issue comes in, because the Arctic is warming and the sea ice is melting, and so the habitat for this animal and its ability to survive has declined. This is one that's native to actual Texas and Mexico. It's the Kemps Ridley sea turtle, really cute little guys. The beaches that are known habitat are protected because sea turtles typically come back to the same beaches to lay their eggs. So when it comes time for hatching, they pretty much hatch at a similar time, and these little guys run smack out to the ocean. And if they survive that without being attacked or killed, and not get drowned as soon as they get in the water and learn how to swim, not attacked by a predator, then they may grow up to be an adult. So between 1940 and 1960, a huge population of Kemps Ridley sea turtles plummeted. People stole their eggs, and then there were regular animals that were in the business of preying on them as well. So these guys got listed in 1970 and the precursor ESA law, and now they're protected under the Endangered Species Act. This is what one looks like up close and personal. So we do have beaches that allow for the Kemps Ridley sea turtle, and they're protected much like Hawaiian monk seal. So this particular prairie bird exists in Texas and existed in grasslands like in Louisiana, Oklahoma area. About 100 years ago, there was 1 million individuals just living in East Texas alone in Louisiana. They had 6 million acres of wonderful grasslands that they could live in, and as grasslands diminished by 90%, remember that from biomes, 1% of their population of habitat remains. So there's a captive breeding program that's in place at Fossil Rim, and then there's also a wildlife refuge down in Eagle Lake, Texas, which is in Matagorda County, and it's called the Atwater Prairie Chicken National Wildlife Refuge. This is a male, and the males have a yellow throat, and they will sing and dance to try to get their mate. So if you want to see something really hilarious, Google search Atwater Prairie Chicken mating season. These are endearing animals, but it's sad because their habitat has been lost, and so that prairie lands is what they need as habitat in order to survive. The Goldencheeked Warbler is a native to Texas as well. It lives in the Edwards Aquifer area, and I mentioned him in Section 9 of the ESA as taking of habitat. It's endangered, and they live in juniper or oak woodlands, and in this area of Texas, especially central and south area, when you look from places like all the way from Temple through Salado in particular, going down towards Austin and then Round Rock, and you go down towards San Marcos and even down towards Bexar County where San Antonio is. This is where the known habitat of this area is located. Other areas got flooded out when we built dams for water storage, so this bird has limited natural habitat. So he's protected, and so is his habitat. He's endangered. This is another famous guy from the Edwards Plateau called the Texas blind salamander. He's endangered. He is about this long, and he lives in the caverns of the Edwards Aquifer. He feeds on small little crustaceans and other types of animals that live in the cavern. As water quality and water quantity, I might add, have diminished in the Edwards Aquifer, this has played a role in the protection of the Texas blind salamander. The Texas blind salamander's existence has actually posed some issues for the expansion of I-35. So understand that endangered species and their habitat can be very, very important. The only known place for the Texas blind salamander is in the Edwards Aquifer. The black-capped viero is a beautiful songbird. It can fill a stadium, football stadium, with a beautiful voice, as tiny a little bird as it is. It lives in the basic same habitat as the Goldencheeked Warbler. It's also endangered. It has another threat of predation or taking its habitat, and that's from the brown-headed cowbirds that like to take the black-capped virero's nest and use them to hatch their eggs, causing the virero to fly away and find other things. So this is an endangered songbird. Moving on to plants, the Texas snowbells are found primarily in 3 specific areas of central Texas. They're going to be in limestone covered ledges and right along stream beds. Now this is a beautiful flower, and I've seen people cut it and put it in their house. I will tell you there's so many more plants that are listed than animals. So always check Texas Parks and Wildlife for endangered plants and see what we have listed, and then check the ESA out as well. This particular plant, the Texas poppy mallow, is also endangered, and it makes a beautiful wildflower up near Lubbock. It's been endangered since 1981 as agriculture has expanded out in that area in population, and mining for sand and gravels, and that area is notorious for sand and gravels because of the Brazos River. This particular flower has lost ample habitat and is endangered because of that. The black lace cactus is also endangered. This actually grows down in South Texas, and it's a cactus that actually flowers. It's been endangered since 1979 because its rangeland habitat has been cleared or planted for agricultural gain. The South Texas Ambrosia is also endangered. This is a weed, and I know people go, really, are you protecting ragweed? I'm really allergic to ragweed. But this particular weed is a threat to being endangered. Conversion of the habitat to agricultural fields has taken its natural ability to grow and decimated its habitat. Another key issue for the species is grasslands have been eradicated by shrub and tree species. So it's taking and competing for the same habitat that the South Texas ambrosia is. So I want to look at a couple of success stories. The grizzly bear is threatened. In 1975, the grizzly was listed as threatened in the lower 48 states, but not in Alaska. Its biggest threat is coming in contact with humans and then having to be euthanized or having human-caused mortalities, which leads to their euthanization. So some laws were put into place as to how to manage national parks, national forests, public lands for bear-proof structures and disposal of food products. So there's some laws if you're going into those areas that contain grizzly bears that you need to comply with. And the standard is not just to protect you, but it's also to protect the grizzly bear. Climate change is another story for the grizzly bear. It has declined the amount of white bark pines, whose seeds are one of the favorites of bears' pastimes that they eat. Warmer temperatures and drought have led to the expansion of the white pine blister rust and pine beetle outbreaks, which has reduced their habitat as well. So you kill off the food resource, the tree giving seeds, and the bear doesn't have as much to eat. So various wildlife programs have been in place to promote grizzly bear recovery, and I'm going to ask that you comply with those camping regulations. They are federal offenses, actually, if you do not. And I want to tell you, because of these efforts, grizzly numbers have tripled in areas like Yellowstone and Grand Teton Range. And it's because of conservation efforts. Gray wolves are only threatened in one state. They're threatened in Minnesota. Gray wolves are endangered in only one state, Minnesota, and they're threatened in the lower 48 states. They are not even regulated and protected in Alaska. But an experimental population was put in place to help bring the gray wolf back from the brink of extinction, because in the Yellowstone area, the wolves were almost eradicated by ranchers because the wolves would kill their livestock. So an experimental population was put in, and Yellowstone successfully breeded a number of packs. It's kind of come full circle, the story has now, because there's a bit too many of them as we speak. So controlling the predators was a big deal back in the 1800s and early 1900s, and it was legal to kill the wolves. Between 1914 and 1926, at least 136 wolves were killed in Yellowstone National Park. By the 40s, the packs were rarely reported, which meant that we had a lack of a major predator, and the ecosystem for the smaller game and even elk population would be at risk. So by 1970, scientists found no evidence of a wolf population in Yellowstone at all, and that's where the experimental population came into play. The Northern Rocky Mountain Wolf Recovery Plan was proposed as the reintroduction plan that would bring the gray wolf back into Yellowstone area. So basically, scientists reported to Congress that they expected the following reductions to occur when this population grew and was implemented. Elk would reduce by 15 to 25%, and bison would be reduced by 5 to 15%. So that was a positive thing for the gray wolf because it was going to help control these populations that were deteriorating. So the reduction in the elk and the bison population would help bring a balance to the ecosystem, and these packs were strategically put in 3 different locations throughout the park region in order to help manage these populations. Well, this is a great time to say we're done with endangered species, and you need to have been prepared by watching all of this content. For quiz purposes, you're going to need to know the listing status of the animals, like if it's threatened, endangered. You're going to need to know the letters that go with the criteria listing. In other words, it's EN for endangered, CR for critically endangered. You're going to need to know what the public comment period is. You're going to need to know the full kit and caboodle for this lecture. So it was 2 parts, and expect us to have a little conversation about it when we see each other next. And so we'll start in on climate change on our next round of lectures. See you back for class. Bye.